speak, and I think the webinar series by BO is a great, enterprise, and I hope it should continue even after lockdown. So coming to pigmented lesions of the conjunctiva, these are a group of things that we often get referrals for. Now, if I talk about, what the most commonest things that we get, the conjunctival nevus or something as, oftentimes we get referrals from ophthalmologists with a diagnosis on it saying conjunctival nevus, melanocytosis, or a melanoma or conjunctival hyperpigmentation. Some of these are proper diagnosis, some of these are not. Like say, for example, conjunctival hyperpigmentation is not necessarily a diagnosis. So there is some amount of confusion, and I thought this could be a good time to touch upon those specifics and see what are the different types of pigmented lesions that we often come across. So the first case is a 16-year-old male. He has, a small speck in the eye since childhood. It was small earlier, but is now gradually increasing in size. The mother is worried, and on Google she has read up about it, and now she's worried that it could be cancer. So what are the key examination findings here? It is unilateral, as you can see.
And I've lost internet.
So it is unilateral. It is present since birth. You can see there is some amount of elevation and there is a variegated appearance. Within these, you can see some little cysts there, some areas of depigmentation. These are intralesional cysts, and obviously there are large feeder vessels here coming in. So these are things that we should know. And once we observe these things, they'll help us come to a diagnosis that it is a conjunctival nevus. The hallmark of a conjunctival nevus is intralesional cysts, and these are cysts. These cysts are things that you can see even on OCT. If you see the anterior segment OCT here, you can see the intralesional cysts appearing as clear spaces, and in the third image below, where there are more cysts rather than pigmented areas. So what is the plan of treatment in this case? It is documentation in terms of the size and location, and 6-monthly follow-up. Very, very rarely this may progress to a melanoma. I'll talk about it when we come to melanoma. So also one thing to note in these cases is that oftentimes patients will present in their teenage years because there are known to be some hormonal receptors even in conjunctival nevi. So along with a growth spurt seen in puberty, these lesions will also increase in size and thickness. And very often they may encroach upon the cornea, at which point, they may say that there is a cosmetic, they feel that it's a cosmetic abnormality and they want to take it off. So that can be done for in those patients. So the next case that I'm going to show is that of a 44-year-old female. She has lesion in only one eye. You can see the eye, there is pigmentation all around. There were always some dark spots present. Recently, she's noticed some increase in pigmentation and it's been painless. Now, when we examine this patient, there is an increasing pigmentation which is recent onset. There is variable pigmentation. There are clear areas of dark areas superiorly and some light areas in the periphery. There is no feeder vessel. This is not elevated. This is flat, and this is diffuse. So in this case, the diagnosis here is primary acquired melanosis, or PAM, P-A-M. Now, PAM is something which is very important because the diagnosis in terms of the biopsy decides what is the further plan of treatment. Now, when biopsied and the pathologist tell you that there is atypia, the primary acquired melanosis with atypia carries a 50% risk of evolution into melanoma. So these cases have to be very watchful whether they can turn into melanoma or not. But PAM without atypia, if your pathologist tells you there is no atypia in it, you can be rest assured that there is nothing to be worried about. But how do you manage these cases? If it's a small area of less than 3 clock hours, you can excise it completely with cryotherapy. If it is more than 3 clock hours, you may want to do a map biopsy to see if atypia is seen in all quadrants. But if there is a past history of melanoma, or it is atypia is seen in all quadrants, you may want to be a little more aggressive, and it is enucleation or extended enucleation has also been advised in some cases, although I think it is too radical for that. Recently, there is some good news. these lesions have been treated by interferon and retinoic acid and have shown some good response. So after a nevus and primary acquired melanosis, we come to this 24-year-old girl who's about to get married, and she's had pigmentation in one eye, which is noticed since birth. This has been gradually getting darker only in one eye and absolutely no variation. It's been static. In terms of the size, there is no variation. So what is this exactly? Now, in these cases, the pigmentation is usually unilateral. It is flat. And if you actually notice it clearly, it is not conjunctival pigmentation. It is under the conjunctival. It is epibulbar pigmentation. There are no cysts, and you can actually move the conjunctiva on top with using a bud. So this is called a nevus of Ota. Now, this is the pathologist, or Japanese pathologist Ota, who described this. This is episcleral pigmentation with pigmentation of the lid and adnexa. There is no risk of conjunctival melanoma, but there is a small risk of uveal melanoma. So the only thing in these cases is to observe and get a fundus examination done every year till the age of 40. After that, depending on if there are any symptoms, then brain MRI may be advised. But these are cases that need to be only observed. The next is a 65-year-old male who was referred from the operating table. He was advised cataract surgery. At the time of making the first paracentesis, the cataract surgeon noticed this pigmentation, and the surgeon had heard a similar talk somewhere in one of the meetings and said, no, I don't want to take a chance, and referred. The patient was hardly bothered or didn't notice anything at all. So what could this be? Now, this is unlike the primary acquired melanosis. This is bilateral, this is flat, but only perilimbal. This does not go into the bulbar, the fornacial, tarsal conjunctiva at all. So this is what is known as racial melanosis. Earlier, it used to be called complexion. Now it's called complexion acquired melanosis. Racial melanosis is now not preferred because of the racial undertone. This is seen primarily in dark-skinned individuals. We must have all seen patients with this. There is zero risk of melanoma, and these patients can be observed, for a long time with no surgery or any action needed. The next is a 55-year-old male, left eye, noticed since 2 months a pigmented elevated mass lesion, again painless. Now here, what do we see? This is unilateral. It is solid, and you can clearly see it is elevated. Here, there are no cystic areas, but there is corneal encroachment. And on top, you can see some white specks, which are keratin specks. On staining with rose bengal, you may also see some devitalized staining happening. And if you see the epicenter, it is exactly at the limbus. To add to this, this patient was HIV positive. So this is a relatively straightforward diagnosis of ocular squamous cell neoplasm. We are used to seeing pinkish or pinkish white gelatinous masses, but they can also have a melanocytic appearance in cases of a pigmented OSSM. Now, in these cases, they may not be as elevated as shown in this photo. They may also be slightly flatter. So the presence of keratin, rose bengal, and the presence of feeder vessels, if all three are present, then there is almost a 95% diagnosis certainty that it is a OSSM. Other things to look for in these cases are the presence of enlarged lymph nodes, whether it actually has infiltrated into the cornea, and which is, as like I mentioned, there's an association with HIV. So you must always get that checked in these patients. Coming to the sixth case, this is courtesy LV Prasad, the image here, because this is a rare condition, not seen commonly amongst Indians, but yes, we should know about it. The 63-year-old male in the right eye, initially they had a small black spot noticed on the conjunctiva. He underwent an excision somewhere, but it rapidly recurred and increased gradually. Now, if you see the image, there is a corneal extension of the pigmented mass. There is a pedunculated component to it also from the conjunctiva. If you see from all angles, there are angry red vessels. Everything about this is screaming malignancy, malignancy, malignancy. And this is a conjunctival melanoma. Sometimes you have to be able to differentiate a conjunctival melanoma from an pigmented OSSM. Conjunctival melanomas are relatively smooth and they don't arise from the limbus, which is usually the case for OSSNs. Now, majority of the conjunctival melanomas are de novo, which means they arise on their own. There is a small percentage of less than 3% of melanomas that arise from nevus, which is why the first case that we saw, conjunctival nevus, they should be observed over time, because there is a very, very rare chance that a nevus may progress to a melanoma. And finally, PAM, primary acquired melanosis with atypia, that we discussed in the second case, can also progress to a melanoma. They, if not treated aggressively, have a very rapidly downhill progress, because 35% of these cases develop metastatic lesions within first 5 years of diagnosis. The treatment, as is for OSSN, is a no-touch technique with wide excision of the conjunctiva, and surrounding healthy conjunctiva has to be treated with double freeze-thaw cryo. Even in this case, I'm just putting one slide that shows even after treatment, you're seeing the recurrence rate of melanomas is still very high. So conjunctival melanomas is a difficult thing to treat, and the progression is rather dismal. So this is giving you an overview. You can take a screenshot. This gives you the exact appearance, the laterality, the specific features, the possibility of malignancy, and finally the primary management in each of these primary pigmented lesions of the conjunctiva. What needs to be done? Talk about a couple of cases before wrapping. This is a young boy. Now, this child presented with a subconjunctival mass, which was amelanotic, but it was enlarged, and you could see that it was jutting out of the conjunctiva. There are no dilated vessels, no feeder vessels. Some conjunctival vessels are prominent, and it enlarged over a period of few months, suggesting it's a benign course. And we excised it, and it turned out to be a schwannoma of one of the possibly posterior ciliary nerves that come in that area. So sometimes there can be unusual lesions at unusual locations. This was a 12-year-old girl. This was a case that I saw at Lokmanya Tilak Sion Hospital, where I'm an honorary. This patient was referred from pediatrics. A 12-year-old girl, 6-month-old history of a pigmented lesion in both eyes. Now, if you see, it is perilimbal in a location. It is bilateral, gradually increasing in size, but relatively flat and not thick. And in the second picture, you can see there's an unusual color. There is a sheen to it, a shiny appearance, no prominent feeder vessels or keratin, and no corneal encroachment. And we put a drop of Paracaine. We took a Q-tip, a bud, and gently touched it to see if there was, if it was mobile. And we could completely scrape off all the pigmentation from this lesion. And you'd be surprised what it was. It was actually kajal. The parents had been applying a locally available kajal with a lot of impurities, and the child had Bitot spots, which creates a irregular surface on the conjunctiva, and the kajal pigments would get smeared across the ocular surface, and because of the irregularity over the Bitot spots, you can see in the picture below, they would go and get accumulated there and gave the appearance of a pigmented lesion. This is also a lesion that is commonly seen, a 35-year-old lady who came with a superior conjunctival lesion. Now, this is not an OSSN. If you see the pattern of the vasculature that you can see on the slit lamp in high magnification, it's like a tree pattern. It's papilliform, as they call, and small blood vessels, each having a core and then spreading out like a branch. Now, this filigree pattern is very, very classical of a papilloma. This papilloma can be an HPV associated lesion or not, and in many cases it can just be a squamous papilloma, which is now being thought to be on the same spectrum as OSSN. Observation can be done. If they enlarge in size or cause some foreign body sensation, then we can excise these lesions. And finally, the last case is this 9-year-old girl who came with this bright red pigmented lesion that was with a stalk and hanging from the upper tarsal conjunctiva. Foreign body sensation was there. It was unilateral, and on that you could see some white little specks within it, yellow specks inside of the mass lesion. There was a feeder vessel. So it didn't look primarily originating from the bulbar conjunctiva. So we excised it and we cryoed the base. And surprisingly, the diagnosis came in as a shock. It was rhinosporidiosis. And then, of course, we came to know the child had gone to her grandparents' house for vacation and taken bath in the streams and ponds where her grandparents lived. And that, as we know, is a common source of rhinosporidiosis. So sometimes a lot of unusual presentations can be there in different parts of the body and the eye as well. So in a nutshell, not every pigmented lesion on the conjunctiva is a nevus. There can be different lesions. There's a big spectrum of pigmented lesions. So a detailed history and examination and documentation is needed. And when in doubt, sending or referring to a specialist is always, as I say, refer is always better than recur. So you'd rather send it to a specialist and have them take care rather than excising it and having it come back. If there are any questions, then you can take them now or at the end of both sessions.
Thank you, Akshay, for teaching us some common, some uncommon lesions. I thought there is only one PAM, paracentral acute middle maculopathy. You taught me one more PAM.
Yeah, we didn't know what the other PAM was.
No, that was a nice presentation. I think Swapnesh,
Yeah, I'm unmuting them.
we'll ask Dr. Rupali also to go ahead with her talk and probably then have the discussion at the end. What do you think?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, that's fine. I think that's a good.
Yeah,
Excellent presentation, Akshay, case-wise.
Very nice, very nice, very good. So Rupali, go ahead. No, start yours, and then after that we'll have a discussion.
Dr. Rupali, you can share your screen.
Yes. Yes.
Wonderful initiative.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Preetham and Dr. Swapnesh, for this talk. Akshay, that was a wonderful presentation. Thanks a lot for that. I'm going to speak on epiphora in a child. Now, epiphora, the term is a Greek word which means a downpour, hence the first slide showing the raindrops. And this causes overflow of tears down the face. The cause of epiphora is the obstruction to a drainage system, the lacrimal drainage system, and that causes the non-patency, and you get watering, which is one of the most common symptoms of any ocular pathology. The commonest cause of epiphora in a child is congenital nasolacrimal duct obstruction, and you syndrome or Treacher-Collins syndrome is commonly seen. You can see it in craniofacial disorders like cleft lip or cleft palate, hypertelorism. The other conditions where there is an obstruction to the outflow can be if there is an atresia or an agenesis of the punctum or the canaliculus. When we are dealing with watering in a child, just rule out that it's not because of a congenital entropion or an acquired entropion. It is not, of course, causing obstruction to the pathway, but it just causes hyperlacrimation or pseudoepiphora. So differentiate between a true epiphora and a pseudoepiphora, and also look out for a functional dysfunction, not an anatomical dysfunction, which means conditions like an ectropion or a lacrimal pump which is failed. Now these are various presentations of CNLDO like an acute dacryocystitis or watering matted eyelashes and crusting of the eyelids. They can present in various forms. Like I said, it occurs in about 20 to 30% of neonates. And the good news is that almost 90 to 95% of them get a spontaneous resolution by the first year of age. The main cause of a congenital nasolacrimal duct obstruction is when there is a failure of the opening of the NLD into the inferior meatus at the valve of Hasner. Also, it could be a bony obstruction, or there could be a failure of the canal to get epithelialized or canalized. Or there may be a hypertrophic inferior turbinate. The history taking will include the duration, that means the onset, the amount of watering and whether it's constant or intermittent, whether there is discharge associated, if there's any previous history of a swelling or any previous procedure in the patient. Look out for the discharge, the crusting, look out for the puncta, which is important in case you're going to plan a probing, and look at the skin around. This is how you can do Roplas, by just taking a Q-tip or a bud and pressing under the medial canthal tendon and getting a discharge. You can also use your finger, or you can ask the mother to use her finger if you don't want to dirty your hands. This is FDDT, that's fluorescein disappearance test, wherein there will be retention of fluorescein after 5 minutes of instilling it in the conjunctival cul-de-sac. The management initially is conservative, and more often than not, it gets okay with, gets solved with a good sac massage. You must teach it to the mother with the child in the mother's lap. The massage, it's important to occlude the common canaliculus. Do it with the index finger, and the massage point is below the medial canthal tendon in the medial part of the eye, with a moderate pressure, about 10 to 15 strokes in the inferior direction, 4 times a day. Intermittently, you can use antibiotic eye drops in case there is any discharge. It's important to tell the patient's parents not to use antibiotic eye drops routinely, and give them a specific number of days that they should use it. Otherwise, many patients come with using eye drops for 3-6 months, and they may develop conjunctival or corneal problems because of that. So we do conservative treatment until the resolution of the epiphora, or at least up to 10 to 12 months of age, unless there are recurrent infections, or with a proper massage, there is no resolution for at least 3 to 4 months. The treatment of choice would be a probing. This is a short video to show a probing. We would first dilate the punctum, and this is the upper punctum getting dilated with the Nettel's punctum dilator. This probing usually we would do after 10 to 12 months of age. It's done under general anesthesia. Once the punctum is dilated, the Bowman's probe, which has been lubricated with antibiotic ointment, is used. By lubricating the ointment, it helps in easier navigation. It also is atraumatic or less traumatic. Now, the direction of probing is first to navigate it through the vertical part of the canaliculus. Then the eyelid is pulled laterally so that the canaliculus straightens. And the probe is then introduced straight. Here, the medial wall is encountered, at which time about 1 millimeter retraction of the probe is done. And then the probe can go in smoothly in the posterior downwards lateral direction. That was the withdrawal, and now that was where the give way was felt. The probing should be done with a very gentle motion. If there's any excess force required, you're probably creating a false passage. This is the size of the probe. It's a 0 number probe, which is 1 millimeter in diameter. To confirm the probe, the success, a fluorescein stained irrigation syringing can be done. At this time, to confirm that it is patent, we can put in a Q-tip into the nose, and you can see the fluorescein which is on the on the Q-tip. Also, because the child is intubated with a throat pack, the throat pack gets stained with the fluorescein. The other way that we can see that we have been a live demo of the probing being successful is if the anesthetist is comfortable enough putting in an infant feeding tube or a suction cannula through the nostril into the nasopharynx, and we can retrieve the fluorescein while we are syringing. This is a paper which was published by Dr. Santosh Honavar, giving us age-appropriate probe sizes. And we can follow that also. Stepwise probing is if you encounter a resistance with an age-appropriate probe, you can go back and take narrower probes or finer probes till you can get through the obstruction, and then sequentially increase the diameter of the probe till you reach the age-appropriate probe. The post-probing management is to continue a massage for at least 2 to 3 weeks, antibiotic steroid eye drops in tapering doses for 3 weeks, and then you follow up the child at 2 weeks, 6 weeks, 3 months, and then at 6 months. It's important to follow up the child at least till the antibiotic steroid eye drops are going on, because many a times the parents would just continue to keep putting the antibiotic steroid eye drops, and you want those to stop. Now, failed probing is seen if the child is of a much older age group, usually after 1.5 to 2 years. If you've initially encountered a firm obstruction, or if it's a bilateral case, cases of failed earlier probings tend to fail again. And if there's a laterally displaced inferior turbinate, in which case you would need to medialize the inferior turbinate. I don't have experience with balloon dactyoplasty, but a failed probing can undergo balloon dactyoplasty with the Lacricat system, and it's an expensive equipment. We can do an intubation, a monocanalicule or a bicanalicular, monocanalicule with the Monoca intubation, and the bicanalicular with either the Crawford tube or Rittlings. I don't have a video of that. In case of multiple failed probings, or if the child presents to you at a later age, or a failed intubation, you might want to do a pediatric DCR. At 4 to 5 years of age, the child may undergo a DCR, and a bicanalicular intubation, which is then removed at 4 to 6 weeks, will be done. One important point to note is to not do a pediatric DCR till you are comfortable with doing an adult DCR, because there's a variation in the anatomy. The pediatric bones are not developed totally. The frontal process of the maxilla and the maxillary process of the frontal bones are not totally developed. The lacrimal bone is not totally developed. The vertical height is less. And the skull base is also lower. So the chances of a damage to the skull base is there. So you've got to be a little careful while doing a pediatric DCR. There's also a chance of fibrosis. It would be worthwhile to use mitomycin C in such cases, and use a 0.02% for 3 minutes around the osteotomy. And intubation would probably work well. External or endonasal DCRs, both can be done. Externals can lead to a small scar, and it may interfere with the lacrimal pump. And endonasal DCR will not lead a scar. It does have a learning curve, and it has equipment. Pediatric endonasal DCR sets are different from the adult sets. So you need to have another set of endonasal equipment. For acute dacryocystitis, patients are first managed with antibiotics. And in a younger age group, the probing is then done earlier. And if the child is slightly older, then a DCR with an intubation would be the treatment of choice. One more important condition that we can see is the dacryocele. It's uncommon, but we need to be aware of it, especially in neonates, because they are obligatory nasal breathers. This dacryocele causes a dilatation of the sac and a dilatation of the nasolacrimal duct. It forms a cyst because of a functional obstruction at the higher up in the canaliculus and lower down with an NLD block at the lower end. So the entire system gets swollen up and forms a cyst. And if it's bilateral, then the child can have respiratory distress. So this swelling is usually, it is seen in the medial canthal area. It is seen inferior to the medial canthal tendon. It's bluish in color. The treatment for this is to marsupialize the intranasal cyst. You can do a linear marsupialization or a cruciate marsupialization, and the contents have to then be released from the cyst that is formed. So this is a child who was a patient of a dacryocele and the post-marsupialization. Also, there is another point to note, that there is a correlation between, or there is an association of CNLDO with anisometropic amblyopia. So all children of CNLDO should undergo a cycloplegic refraction, because around 10 to 12% of children of CNLDO have a chance of anisometropic amblyopia. And 90% of these children tend to be hyperopes. So a cycloplegic refraction, which is then repeated at 3 to 4 years, should be done. I would leave you with a few points. One, CNLDO treatment is highly successful with this massage with the proper technique. You want to do a probing by the first year of age, up to 2 years, or even later. Even a child who comes to you later can do a probing. For failures, we may try to do intubations of balloon dacryoplasty, a DCR at 4 to 5 years of age, and we must watch for amblyopia. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rupali. I think the moderators can take over now and start with the discussion.
Screen
share.
Dr. Akshay?
Yes, sir.
Dr. Akshay, a wonderful presentation. Just a point, you said that when there are cases of PAM, you would like to try and observe. What are the signs that you would like to think are ringing the bells that you would like to send them to the oculoplastic surgeon?
So I think for PAM, I'd like to biopsy first. 3 clock hours or less, the plan would be to completely excise. If it is in more than 3 clock hours, but less than 6 clock hours, one would still think of excision. But if it is diffuse and spread into multiple clock hours, then a map biopsy to see if there is any atypia in any of those quadrants, and then treatment after that. Conventional treatment for that has been mitomycin C. But now, as I said, interferon and retinoic acid has also been shown to be effective. So for PAM, which is diffuse pigmentation across the entire conjunctival surface, I would send immediately rather than wait.
And because this is even watched by general ophthalmologists, right? And other for ocular surface. So is there anything that as a general ophthalmologist that we can do if we are going to be following up the patients for several years? What I'm trying to say is, you have sent it to an oculoplasty surgeon. He has done the biopsy. He finds it's negative. He comes back to you and he's going to follow up with you. Then what do you do?
Yeah. So then in that case, follow up in terms of photo documentation, just to see that the size and thickness in terms of whatever it is. And then observing every 6 months to a year is okay. But if there is any change in thickness or in the intensity of pigmentation or the size, that would be a red flag that, I would like to check again if atypia has, evolved over time. Because like a simple, topically that the topic is corona. So one negative corona test, COVID test doesn't mean you will never get it. So at one point, if you've been biopsied without ATP, doesn't mean that the
Exactly.
TAM cannot evolve. So an annual checkup and looking out for increase in size of thickness, increase in intensity of pigmentation are red flags that I'd like to watch out for.
Yeah, one point I would just like to add before I stop is in order to find out for the size, every slit lamp has got the conical beam. So with that, the spot size, you can try and evaluate for yourself about how many millimeters it is, and thereby that can be acting as a follow-up guide.
Right.
I think there are a couple of questions also, Shankar, which have come up, which you can put to both of them. Akshay, all of you all. I'll just read some of those. So this one says, it's from Dr. Ashish. It says, so which age would you start probing for treatment of CNLDO? But I think that Rupali has answered actually in her presentation. So I'll just take the next one. This is a nice one. It's from Nupur. For fluorescein dye disappearance test, how would you interpret it if the child is crying? That's her first question. And Rupali, second question is, what is the role of an antibiotic drop in CNLDO and how long would you go about putting it?
So an interpretation of an FDDT where the child is crying, most of it is obviously going to come out. But there still might be some remaining in the inferior fornix or in the superior fornix, mostly in the inferior fornix. And if that is still there at the end of the crying, then you would interpret that. The second way would probably be to put some topical eye drops, like lignocaine or paracaine, wait for it to act, and then ask the mother to put fluorescein eye drops instead of a fluorescein strip, and then see it.
I can, if I can add,
Yes, please.
ask the child can be asked to blow into a kerchief, one nostril at a time, because if he blows with both sides on the tissue, there will be some amount of a dye. We would not be able to identify on which sides if you are thinking that it is going to be bilateral. Blowing into a tissue probably may help, because I don't think we will be able to try and look into the nostril to find out.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
What's the second question?
One of the other questions is, either you or Akshay can take that, Rupali, is how early can we do an endonasal DCR? This is from Dr. Samir Bagewari.
No, you said there were two questions by.
Yeah, the role of antibiotic drops in CNLDO.
Oh, sorry.
Go into the chat.
Yeah, role of antibiotic drops in CNLDO, in congenital NLDO.
Use it intermittently if there's a lot of discharge. I would not really recommend just putting eye drops, because then it gives you a false sense of security that it's getting okay. You wouldn't do a massage. That would probably become your mainstay of treatment. And there would be, you don't know the duration at which they would use it. So you would use it only if there's discharge. For managing a CNLDO, I think massage would be the mainstay till such time that it doesn't resolve when you need to take the child up for probing.
Thanks, Rupali. And regarding the endonasal DCR, how early can we do it?
Anything after 2 years of age, if you have all the equipment, I think would be, unless you, if you can make the child wait. I think that the later the more you delay it, the better size of osteotomy you would get, and you would probably have more control of all the anatomy of the lacrimal sac, the nasal mucosa. And, if you take off a lot of mucosa of the child, you may land up with I don't know, loss of smell, I guess.
Dr. Rupali, would you want to do an infracture every time that you do probing, and along with stenting?
You mean medialization of the turbinate?
Yes.
No. If the probe goes in easily, if you have an endoscope and you're visualizing the probe, in the inferior meatus. You don't need to infracture.
Yeah.
That there is enough medialization already, so you don't need to really touch. I think the lesser you touch any normal tissue, the better it is for an outcome in any surgery, not just nasolacrimal duct surgeries. So no, I wouldn't. I wouldn't intubate for every patient. No,
Yeah.
not at all.
Akshay, what has your experience about endonasal DCR in a pediatric age group? So the reason I'm asking is I preferably don't do much endonasal DCR in pediatric age groups, and in adults also I refer them to an oculoplastic surgeon who's comfortable in doing them. So I'm not sure about Rupali and Shankar and Kruti, but I know that Akshay does endonasal DCR. So
Endonasal DCRs as it is are a little slightly technically difficult than external for us. And in children, the space is even lesser. So how the rule of how early can we do a DCR? I'd say at least 4 to 5 years. And how early can you do an endonasal DCR? As soon as the surgeon is comfortable with the minimal space. So 4 to 5 years is the cutoff for a DCR. Beyond that, endoscopic or external is the surgeon's choice. But I'd probably wait a little longer because, but having said that, I have seen surgeons like, say, for example, bilateral CNLDO, failed probing, but the child has a squint or the child has a congenital cataract that also needs to be operated. Like Dr. Rupali said, then you can go in and do it as early as you have to, because unless you address that, you cannot do your intraocular surgery.
Kruti, you were saying something?
No, I was just saying that endonasal, most of us, I think, are comfortable with higher age groups itself. And for youngers, yes, I do agree with Akshay that as much as you can push.
So there's another one saying that I think this question comes a lot often, even we are asked in our OPD clinics, so it's to everyone, is that how many times can we repeat a probing if it fails in the first attempt? So I'll just rephrase that. I think till what age would be a better question. Can you continue to probe if it fails in the first attempt? So for me, if it fails in the first attempt, depending on the inference of the probing, whether it's a soft stop, a hard stop, bony stop, irrespective, unless it's an absolute clear-cut hard stop and I'm not getting anything, I would still go in for even a second or a third probing, because it has been shown that second and third probings almost take care of most of the obstruction. And my oldest patient has been 7.5 years, who has got a successful results after probing on the second attempt at 7 years. Any of the other panelists, please?
Yeah, Rupali, you were saying something.
I would also see whether the probing was done under full general anesthesia or not, and whether or not it was too young and an office probing was done, and whether it was done under ketamine. So I would probably do a probing, unless it's done by somebody who I know does probing regularly. I would probably repeat the probing, and maybe also do it from the inferior canaliculus to the lower punctum. If I'm taking up a child for a DCR, I would probably first probe. If I'm successful, I would then not do the DCR also. So even if the child is 10 years old, I try to probe it once. The child is under anesthesia, so what difference does it make anyway?
And Dr. Savri, we could also extrapolate this question as to a patient with a CNLDO with no intervention before. What is the highest age at which you would intervene? As in if a person comes with you at the age of 14, would you still do a syringing probing? I think this is a question that a lot of general offices do have, so it would be good to address.
Akshay, Shankar, would you like to take that?
Yeah, so actually there's this paper of Dr. Honavar where he's reported the success rates of probing in 5 children 5 years or older. And he's, if they've shown that as the age increases, starting at 5 years, the success rate itself is around 40%, up till the age of 10, where the success rate is less than 10%. But these are children who have never been probed before. So if a patient actually comes to me and the child has never been probed and I have not probed, I am willing to give that, till the age of between 5 to 8, I do what is called as a probing SOS DCR. If I do a probing and I feel that at that point it will be patent, and then I let it be. But if sometimes you see that you've figured out that there is a bony stop, or you put in an endoscope and you cannot visualize the metal probe, then you can convert it to a DCR at that time in that sitting itself. So
Yes.
5 to 8 years of age, I'm okay to do what is called a probing SOS DCR. But beyond 8 years, we know that the results are really bad. So I have now started counseling for a DCR from 8 years onwards.
Yeah, even for the probing also, when a general ophthalmologist takes up the patient for probing, in the test, we need to be extremely careful even when we are doing the dilatation, because many times we end up breaking the sphincters of the punctum and then having a tear of the punctum and things like that. So I think that can be avoided. And also when we do a probing, we have to put our notes very carefully on the paper so that the person who the patient goes to next can have an insight of what the surgeon dealt with. How far was the block basically after inserting the probe from the punctum, that we can easily measure it from the punctum from the probe. And also the surface anatomy of the direction in which the probe needs to go in, that also I think if it is done properly, I think the next surgeon, if at all there is, would be having an advantage too.
Right. So maybe we should take a few more questions that have come up.
Go ahead, Kruti.
Yeah. So there is this: how safe is it to do syringing immediately after probing? I guess on table, all of us do check after probing whether it's patent or no. But if anyone has anything to add to it, please do.
I think it depends on whether you have intubated the child
Exactly.
or not. So a lot of people at their clinics do probing with ketamine, with the anesthetist giving just slight intravenous ketamine to induce the child or sedate the child. In that case, the child's reflex is still very much present. And in those cases, you want to inject very, very less, or you place a suction tube in the nose and take out any fluid that comes in. In those cases, you want to be a little wary of syringing, especially flushing in a lot of fluid. But if you've intubated, like the video that Rupari showed, which is the ideal way to do it, in that case, you can, if there's a throat pack and you've intubated with a safety cuff, there's no problem in irrigating after probing at all.
Even a laryngeal mask anesthesia works extremely well. So
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, that works too.
You can put a little bit of fluorescein into the irrigation fluid as well. That will help us identify.
I think this is a good question. It's from Dr. Divya. Is there a role of dacryocystography or lacrimal scintillography?
Role of dacryocystography.
I mean, I think
Child.
what I'm trying to say is, I think what are the indications when you can do or should do either of these?
So whenever we are ordering investigations in pediatric age group, especially something which is radiological, you have to really know when you're doing it, because anything and everything that you do will require general anesthesia. So I would be very conservative in ordering a dacryocystography or a scintigraphy, primarily because you're one, subjecting the child to general anesthesia, and two, you're subjecting the child to a radiation which more often than not is unnecessary. Very rare if you really want to know whether it's an anatomical or a functional block, or where is the site of the block, having done many failed procedures, that is probably one of the times that would want to subject the child to all these investigations. In an adult, you can do it for many more reasons, but in the child, you would want to just, you know, rely more on your clinical skills and judgment and OPD examination rather than a general anesthesia. So maybe if it's a, you know, a failed DCR, or maybe if it's a block which you're not able to determine where it is, or whether it's functional or an anatomical block, maybe those are the 3 times that you would want to.
Yeah,
I
agree.
I think an easier thing would be to get an opinion from another oculoplastic surgeon rather than subject the child to a GA. I would probably send it to my colleagues for their opinion.
Yeah, I agree. So basically, dacryocyntography or lacrimal scintigraphy, any lacrimal investigation like this, we need to know what do we do with the report that comes showing where the situs obstruction is. And in a child with CNLDO, none of these investigations is going to lead us to a plan which is different from probing or DCR. So in children, I don't think dacryocyntography or scintigraphy has a role, except in, say, cleft palate, cleft lip syndromes, or any other physical abnormality where you are seeing a congenital abnormality, structural abnormality. But in adults, the 4 indications where I use these investigations are a repeated failed DCR, traumatic NLDO, SALDO, or any other secondary cause of NLDO, or functional NLDO where you syringe and it is patent, but the patient still has significant epiphone. Just one question, somebody had asked, share a link on YouTube. I'm actually sharing a link now. This is the video or demonstration of the lacrimal massage, well, lacrimal compression, not massage. I'm just sharing my screen for a second. This is a pet peeve of mine. This is a massage. This is a compression. We don't do lacrimal massage. We do lacrimal sac compression. And the technique is to bring the finger from downwards upward into the medial canthus such that you compress the lacrimal sac and the opening of the common canalicularis. And the force that is being built up by the compression pops open the valve of Hassner below. So what I like to do, like Dr. Rupali said, demonstrate on the child and have the mother record it on her phone while I demonstrate it on the child. Then I demonstrate it on the mother so she knows how it is. And then send them on WhatsApp the clip that I've shared on YouTube and ask them to watch the clip each time and do it over the next 2-3 weeks. 10 times in the morning, 10 times in the evening, 10 times in the afternoon and at night, and call back at 1 month to recheck. Ever since I've started sharing with the WhatsApp clip and showing it on YouTube, I've found that success rates are actually better. Otherwise, we get all sorts of lacrimal sac compression patients doing this, patients doing this, and just touching the nose like with a feather or something like this, which are absolutely useless. So show it on YouTube, demonstrate it on the mother, ask the mother to record it on her phone while you're demonstrating it on the child, and to watch it each time they do it again is very effective.
I think that can be taken as a thesis topic for a PG.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
I think we kind of covered anything else, Shankar?
One thing that we should tell, since we have many general ophthalmologists also attending, is COVID guidelines for lacrimal system.
Yes.
So one thing is we avoid syringing, and to test the patency of the system, the drainage system, we can do an FDDT or we can do a ROPLAS. And any aerosol generating procedures like a DCR, external or endonasal, any other mucosal procedures like a buccal mucosal graft, those need to be avoided. If there is an urgency in doing a lacrimal drainage system surgery, then probably a DCT is what will need to be done, with, of course, the epiphora after that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's an excellent point, Rupali. Just to clarify, coming in the next few months, that is going to be something that we're going to have to avoid. So I think we've covered most of the questions. Any last points or anything anyone would like to add? I think.
No, I think Rupali made a very important point here, because in fact today afternoon only we were discussing on the MOS webinar about the sac syringing part, and I believe the rationale is that sac syringing can cause aerosol. Am I right, Rupali? So that's why it should be avoided.
Yes, actually, this point was hammered in by Akshay to me, that you must mention it, because this is something that we need to avoid. So thank you, Akshay.
Yeah, as we speak, in fact, today there's been a circulated mail by the Oculoplasty Association of India Executive Committee that where we are coming up with guidelines for lacrimal surgery, but all elective surgeries in the next few weeks following the relaxation of lockdown, including DCR, endonasal or external, or syringing in the OPD should be avoided. There's a very important question of how will DCT solve the problem of epiphora. DCT will not solve the problem of epiphora, but in a patient with recurrent acute dacryocystitis, taking the sac out will prevent dacryocystitis from occurring. Especially in an elderly patient, a DCT may be a solution, but in a younger patient, you would rather treat the patient with oral antibiotics and put them on a slightly longer duration of topical eye drops to prevent acute dacryocystitis from happening again, till there is a safer environment and time where we can then do a DCR. And also there was another question of if there's any role of syringing in dacryocystitis in adults. There is no role, because dacryocystitis is a very clinical diagnosis. You can see the edema, the tense sac, and the pain along with the lacrimal abscess formation. Irrigation and those times is extremely painful and contraindicated. So if diagnosed already, then there is no need for that. In very, very subacute cases of chronic dacryocystitis where you're unsure, you may do it. But in acute dacryocystitis, there is no role for syringing.
So I think if that sums it up, then I'll conclude. Swapnesh, you want to say anything?
No, thank you all. Thank you the speakers for a very lucid presentation and the moderators. All the attendees who are interested in oculoplasty can log in again by 8 o'clock, because we have a session on eyelid anatomy by Dr. Sumit Lane. And Dr. Vidya Shankar sir, please log in again because you are the moderator for the same.
I have a confession to make, In the past few webinars, I've been introducing and then I've been going off to sleep or doing some other work. Today was a time when both the presentations I saw from start to finish.
Wow.
I'm sure you say that in all non-retina.
That's not fair.
Preetam, I'm going to take your Viva later. Wait.
Thank you, Akshay, Rupali, Sabri, Vidya Shankar, Kruti. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I will take your Viva. Sapnesh, I'm going to take your Viva also.
Thank you.
Bye then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful work. Keep it up.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
sir,
Sabri.
Thank you.
Pritam sir, I'll end the meeting.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah.
Thank you.